The House of the Dead is a series that's extremely important to me. It's easily one of the most famous and recognizable icon series out there, but it strikes a special chord in my heart. Because in many ways, this was the first horror game series I ever played, and so it resonates with me a lot more than many other games have. Sure, I understand that many people may think otherwise as to the series being a horror game, but I would like to argue for it. Not only did it used to terrify me as a kid, but I attribute this more to the fact that the series as a whole presents itself far more distinctively and idiosyncratically than any of its horror or like-gun game contemporaries. The House of the Dead is a series with an identity, and one that can be found in each of the games. Some games do certain components of that identity better than others, but all this accumulates to a series that is truly special to me. This is a series I love dearly, a series I've spent hours and hours memorized by its intricate details, and a series that has not only terrified me as a kid, but still creeps me out to this day. It's had an impact on me, so to say, furthermore affecting my love for horror games in many ways. So that's my angle here. My goal with this retrospective is to find out what is the strongest element of each game, how it gives the series its identity, and why these elements make the series so special to me. Back in the early 90s to early 2000s, Sega was kind of the dominant force when it came to arcade games. While many people look fondly on this period in Sega's history, more for the Genesis, Saturn, Dreamcast, and all of the games that have come out of it, many tend to overlook the legacy and innovation Sega had on arcades. From the 80s to the early 2000s, Sega put games out like Outrun, Afterburner, Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Daytona USA, Crazy Taxi, Super Monkey Ball, Ghost Squad, and so many other prominent arcade titles. But out of their massive discography of video games is the notable and innovative Virtua series. Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter, and Virtua Striker were all games that had this cool hip new thing called three-dimensional polygonal graphics. Which they weren't the first to use them, but it was how they were used that was so revolutionary. Virtua Racing laid the groundwork for 3D racing games and generated a hype and demand for 3D polygonal graphics, simply by drastically improving the quality of the polygons and polygon count, improving frame rate, adding more complex scenery, using multiple camera angles, and even having full 3D character models. Virtua Fighter became the world's first 3D fighting game. Characters' environments can now be defined more distinctively by rendering polygons in real time. Characters can also move three-dimensionally as well, with their fighting moves also being more clearly defined and having more smooth animations. It even had a dynamic camera that would move cinematically, providing neat camera angles. Virtua Striker was one of the first sports games to use 3D polygons and was also notable in being one of the earliest usages of texture mapping, with Daytona USA also using them just shortly before. These games were all extremely important and genre-defining. But there is one game I haven't talked about yet, one that is important to address, and one I have saved for dramatic effect. Just like the other games mentioned prior, Virtua Cop was the first light gun shooter to use three-dimensional polygons rendered in real time. You see, most light gun games weren't like what they are now. A lot of them just used two-dimensional sprites and one single static background. The most famous of these being Duck Hunt, and other examples including Hogan's Alley, one of the first games to use a light gun for a controller, Wild Gunman, Operation Wolf, and even horror-themed ones like Chiller, Beastbusters, and Laser Ghost. But Virtua Cop changed everything. Environments were now fully three-dimensional, allowing for more detailed scenery with dramatic camera pans. Characters and enemies were also polygonal as well, providing more defining and distinctive features. And because of the real-time rendering, enemies can now react differently depending on where they were shot, and the player can interact with the environment as well, with glass and crates breaking when shot. That's not even mentioning the fast-paced and addictive gameplay Virtua Cop had. Enemies can appear from almost anywhere, and the lock-on-sight feature would show the player when the enemy was going to shoot, which gave the game a sense of urgency and intensity while playing. Virtua Cop pretty much defined modern-day light gun games, and all of the Virtua games were developed by the iconic and beloved Sega AM1 team. They were pretty much the big boys on campus when it came to the arcade. I mean, not only did they make all the Virtua games and pretty much single-handedly changed video gaming forever, but they made the previously mentioned Outrun, Afterburner, Daytona USA, and of course, the iconic, revolutionary, and beloved fighting game, Sonic the Fighters. Sega AM2 was the dream team, so to say. So, in a way, there was a lot of pressure and competition amongst the other development teams. Sega AM3 was another one of Sega's arcade developers, whose discography extends from Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, Jurassic Park and Jurassic Park The Lost World, Sega Rally Championship, Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, and the Crazy Taxi series. And then we have Sega AM1. Sega AM1 is supposedly Sega's oldest developer division, formed around 1984, and at the time was really only known for making action games and beat-em-ups. Some of their successful and noteworthy titles include the previously mentioned Ultra Beast and Golden Axe, along with games like Alien Storm, Shinobi, and Shadow Dancer. However, in 1991, when Sega AM3 was formed, many of the AM1 developers had to move to AM3. During this time, the AM1 team put out more Golden Axe sequels and a sequel to Outrun, Outrunners. AM1 and AM3 were the underdogs when it came to their rival AM2. Even now, Sega AM2 is remembered more fondly as more of an icon than AM1 and AM3. But in 1996, things changed. Within Sega AM1, a team got together to talk about something they collectively wanted to make. Some of these people included Hiroyuki Taguchi, a designer who had previously worked on 𝕬𝕬𝕜𝕤 and Cool Riders, Kazutomo Senbonji, a programmer who had worked on Outrunners and also Cool Riders, Koji Uto, another programmer who had worked on Golden Axe Duel, Virtua Fighter Kids, and Die Hard Arcade, and Takashi Oda, a planner and director who just finished overseeing Puzzle and Action Treasure Hunt. This team got together and they talked about wanting to make a light gun game, which none of them have ever had experience actually making one before, but they thought it would be cool to make one. After talking amongst each other, considering a police-themed game, even pitching the game as a horror-themed game based on capturing ghosts, they finally settled on a zombie game. Right away, they knew they wanted to differentiate the game from Virtua Cop, but still use the game as a sort of reference. They wanted to give the game a more cinematic look, for instance, believing it would give the player a better look into the world they were presenting. They also wanted to make the game gory, adding so much detail to the point where eyeballs would fly off when heads are shot, and seeing the bone on a severed limb, to also give it more of a style to its counterpart. The designers would also add an insane amount of detail to its location, the mysterious mansion, even going so far as to adding trim to the doorway of the mansion. They even brought in second composer and sound engineer Tetsuya Kawachi to provide the music and iconic sound effects of the game. One of the biggest differences from Virtua Cop was since the enemies were zombies, they would walk towards the player, being more resilient and taking more bullets before dying. This was all being led by the director and the series creator Takashi Oda. Well, not really the main creator, since, as mentioned earlier, no one person came up with the idea to make a light gun game. It was something everyone in the team wanted to do. Originally, I had it in my head that Takashi Oda was like this super genius man who was like, "What up, motherfuckers? We're about to make some hype shit." But nah, it was more like, "So, you guys want to make this?" Yeah, and neat. That's not to say that Oda didn't have any influence or that he wasn't the series creator. He undeniably is. While it's not really credited anywhere, it's been heavily implied by staff, specifically the producer for House of the Dead 4, Yasuhiro Nishiyama, that Oda is the main dude who created much of the story elements of the game and the main idea guy. Oda has also stated that the movie 7 and the manga Blackjack have had an influence on the development of the game and even the series. He felt that 7 was incredibly memorable and said that the atmosphere and visual presentation resonated with him, having an effect on the original game itself. Blackjack had more of an influence on the story, in particular the backstories of the characters. Oda has said that the main character Blackjack isn't always moral, and that the story is set up in a way where the reader draws their own conclusions about what's right and wrong. Even the characters have their own ideas about what actions are good or evil, but there's never really a right answer, so he's always tried to have that element in the games. So yeah, Oda was definitely the main guy behind the series, but it's just that it would be disingenuous to dismiss what the other members of the team contributed to creating the game and the series. For instance, Hiroyuki Taguchi was one of the designers that came up with much of the gameplay elements for the original game. Taguchi even mentioned that he had an idea for what's called the reflection system. Basically, the idea was that there would be two monitors, one in the front and one behind the player, and that the player would have to look back to see if there were any enemies from behind. He even drew a concept of a blowback gun that would have used compressed air instead of the blowback being electric. Obviously, none of these ideas worked out, but it just shows that there wasn't just one dude coming up with all of this. It was very much a team effort. And in being a team effort, it came with a lot of difficulties. Kazutomo Senbonji mentioned that, again, it was the team's first time making a light gun game, and that they had to deal with a lot of things that they were just now learning. Koji Oto said that they were facing a lot of pressure from their rival teams, Sega AM2 and Sega AM3. Oda even said that members of Sega would walk in and look at their work before jokingly running away and screaming in fear. Senbonji even heard that people felt they should have gone further with the gore. In a way, the team was worried about getting in trouble or disappointing people. Eventually came September 13th, 1996, the game's Japanese release, and March 4th, 1997, the game's international release. And yeah, that shit blew up. Everywhere, the House of Dead became an instant classic. It was more than a success. It was one of the biggest games of 1996 and 1997. There were near flawless reviews of the game for the arcade version. This game alone is considered to be one of the greatest light gun games and even arcade games of all time. So what made the House of Dead so special? Well, for many people at the time, they attributed it more to the gameplay and the gore. The gameplay was so fast-paced and energetic, yet it felt extremely tense and frightening because of how quick you had to be before you were attacked. The graphics and the gore was extremely ahead of its time, with the way heads, eyeballs, limbs, and chests explode in a grotesque but flashy manner. I also love the game for those reasons as well, but for me, there was something very intriguing about the game, which was something I noticed whenever I saw the game at an arcade. When I was a kid, there was this one pizza place that was really popular in my neighborhood. Everyone knew about it, and it was an extremely favorable place for parties and getting together with family and friends. Even a lot of the local sports teams went there and still continue to do so today. And one of the reasons for this was not only because of the great pizza, but because it had an arcade. Now, as a kid, the arcade was one of the few places where I could actually play a variety of games, and in particular, shooters. My parents were pretty strict about what games I could and couldn't play, for they were afraid I'd become violent, and many of the typical conservative attitudes towards video games, which really sucked, but thankfully, this arcade was here, and so whenever my brother and his sports teams were done playing for the season and went to the pizza place for a team party, I pretty much took the opportunity to play all the games that were there. So one of my earliest memories of going to that place was seeing a mysterious arcade cabinet. It had this aesthetically pleasing blue and black gradient, but it gave off like a sort of perturbed feeling, combined with some white marks that are slightly blurred. Above it was this warning covered in blood splatter that said, "Keep out, this shooting game strikes terror into the person's heart." I don't know why I'm doing it in that voice. Which as a kid, I pretty much took that to heart, as I thought it would be a game that would legit terrify me. In the front was a blood red holster with a slash mark in it, with the admittedly comical, "The Guns of Justice." My voice. Pointing to the agents and the guns that you would be playing and using, as well as giving information about those characters, which was strangely neat and a bit encouraging. Reading about these characters that I'm about to play, who are treated as these heroes, as I'm about to wield one of the guns of justice and take on their character. Above the holsters were the instructions for the game, that had a decayed and deteriorating looking zombie, with its eyes masked by shadows, standing defiantly, almost as if this single zombie was going to be a challenge. The zombie appears again on the side, towering over a gigantic gothic mansion, this time with a blood red gradient making the clouds look crimson, and a text above saying, "It feeds on your fear. Don't go into the house alone." Which made me proper scared to even touch the game at this point. There are even small details like the slashes in the machine themselves. But where my attention was drawn to over time was the title, with the zombie and a man in a trench coat coated in black and pen scribbles on it, looking like he's walking to, or just simply staring at a zombified arm extending out to him, almost as if it's asking for the man to join it. Or maybe he's begun to become zombified himself, my mind would wonder. The title is in a blood red and outlined in black, and simply reads, "The House of the Dead," in its glorious and eerie gothic font. What I find really cool and what fascinates me a lot as a kid was that already, without even looking or seeing any of the gameplay, the arcade cabinet establishes a thick layer of atmosphere that an onlooker is drawn to. I used to stare at this game from a distance, admiring it, and not even realizing at the time how it's drawn me to it. It leaves you with a sense of mystery about what the game is like, and if it's indeed as terrifying as it makes it out to be, but also leaves the player with a bit of taste of the gothic horror they're going to experience. So when you do finally approach the cabinet and look at the screen, looking at the classic "Winners don't use drugs," a mysterious intro plays. The flickering numbers of December 18th, 1998, cutting to a ringing phone before panning to a framed photo of 3 people, 2 men and a woman. It then flashes white as the camera reveals 3 decaying and bloodied zombies in some dungeon or something, almost stumbling towards the camera in a way. Another flash of light reveals a zombie with a fucking chainsaw chasing 2 people, one of them about to run into another zombie stumbling towards him. Like, dude, I get you're running away from a zombie with a motherfucking chainsaw. That scared me a lot too. But you might want to look up, just saying. It cuts away again to 2 really bony and decomposed zombies in a dirty sewer, with 2 bodies laying on a floor with a close-up of one of them, blood running from its body. It then shows a woman, presumably the one in the photo prior, backing towards the door and raising her hands in fear as 2 zombies are staggering towards her. Then you see a bearded man in a trench coat firing a gun into a muscular zombie, tearing his arm, blowing a hole in its chest before delivering a headshot that takes off half of its head, before zooming in on a man holding his gun all cool-like. Afterwards, you see a man dressed in a nice suit doing a sick tactical roll and pointing his gun, which I thought was like the coolest thing as a kid. Finally, a fancily dressed man in white wearing glasses, presumably talking or breathing heavily, is staring at some sort of machinery that is no doubt really sciencey, as my younger self would have put it, with some figure that is obscured because small, masked by shadow and also low resolutions, but it was mysterious and spooky to me. It finally reveals the classic gothic red title of the House of the Dead once again, as it zooms in on a very dark, ominous, and huge mansion. Now, keep in mind, because this was at a restaurant, you weren't hearing all the sounds in the intro, so it was silent the whole time, which I understand why. After all, I really doubt parents want to hear
the House of the Dead.
Like, I can see that being a bit irritating when no one is playing the game at all. But in a weird way, the lack of sound made everything feel more ambiguous and unsure. You really didn't know what was going to happen. In fact, for the longest time, I thought Kyrian here was actually a hostage or a scientist looking at whatever terrifying thing is right there. Only years later to discover that with the sound.
You shall all die. The House of the Dead.
Yeah, this guy may be the evil and bad. But the ambiguity of what you didn't know about the game made me feel extremely uneasy when I was just simply looking at it. Where did the zombies come from anyway? Who are these cast of characters? What even is this mansion anyway? What was that thing inside of that gigantic futuristic machine? I didn't really know what to make of it, but what I saw majorly frightened me. The imagery of the bodies bleeding out, the chainsaw zombie especially fucked me up. Those creepy environments that you saw, I was extremely intimidated by it back then, and even now, whenever I see the game, I still get this unsettling feeling about it all. Now, this was all without me actually playing the game. When I finally decided to put that quarter in, hearing the compressed sound of a wolf howl, I knew shit was about to go down. But weirdly enough, it wasn't really the gameplay that would end up getting to me in the end. Don't get me wrong, the gameplay is fantastic and incredibly fun. The gameplay is so intense and accompanies the game so well, and I'll bring that up when I talk about a later game. Nah, what got to me was the same thing that intrigued me when I saw that beautifully creepy arcade cabinet and that unsettling and ominous intro. The House of Dead has a perfect sense of atmosphere, and weirdly enough, it starts with the otherwise untalked about story. The year is 1998, and a man named Dr. Roy Kyrian is the lead scientist for the DBR Corporation and is trying to study the nature of life and death. Working in his mansion, he becomes more and more obsessed with his research to the point where the experiments become more inhumane and morally questionable, causing many of his researchers to leave. The experiments and creations become even more heinous as Kyrian's mental health begins to deteriorate. Then on December 18th, 1998, Kirin goes insane and releases his creations onto the mansion. On that same day, however, AMS agent Thomas Rogan ends up getting a call.
Help! Everyone getting killed!
You see, Thomas Rogan is actually engaged to Sophie Richards, one of the DBR researchers, who tells Rogan about what Kirin has done. This makes Rogan and his partner, a man only known as G, to go to the mansion to investigate and rescue Sophie. Once they get there, they find the mansion overrun with zombies, even seeing a researcher getting attacked and mortally wounded from one. This researcher then gives them a journal detailing all of Kirin's creatures before dying. As they are fighting their way to the mansion, they end up finding Sophie, who starts running to them only to get brought by the hangman and taking her with it. Now, both Rogan and G had to journey into the mansion, not only to save Sophie, but to stop Kirin and his plans before they get further out of hand. Now, granted, that may not exactly sound all that special. In fact, you may feel that the plot feels more tame, if anything. But tonally, the story is quite unique in how it conveys a sense of chaoticness, which is pretty neat in my opinion. Like, you've probably played games where its story was kind of tumultuous and felt very stressful because of what was happening. While House of Dead definitely relays that feeling gets amplified here. Everything can feel weirdly intense and heavy from all the stuff you are witnessing. Not only are you seeing hordes of zombies, but you are seeing bleeding bodies literally thrown around the mansion. People getting killed off right in front of you. Sophie even getting further and presumably dies. Massive creatures that you have to fight, and a madman taunting you along the way. For some odd reason, everything feels impossible, as if you know the situation is so absurd and undurable to even try. Yet here you are going to try and win despite the odds stacked against you. It's such a strange feeling that's communicated here, but that's what makes it intriguing. You still want to try and save the day despite everything suggesting the contrary. Not just because it's a challenge, but because all the stuff you've seen makes you feel obligated to in a way. A part of you feels you have to do this. It makes that previous tagline, "Don't go into the house alone," make a lot more sense in retrospect. You're witnessing horrible shit firsthand on top of having to deal with a horde of zombies, but you're still going through with it, with or without a friend next to you. It really makes you anxious knowing all of this, especially as a little kid and seeing all of this. It was a very apprehensive premonition. I know this may all sound silly, considering most people have this idea of House of Dead as this fun, lighthearted arcade shooter with zombies and gory effects, but as an extremely imaginative kid, I constantly pondered about the little story I was given from the intro. For a while, I didn't even touch it, watching from a distance as I was seeing the images of the intro. I was genuinely scared of the game. It was one of the first horror games I've seen anyway. Over time, however, I became more confident and approached it for the first time. Seeing all these hordes of zombies with all the people running from them, the cool images of Rogan and G, and the mysterious machine that Kirin was looking at, I felt this mixed sense of fear and obligation. Fearful for all the stuff I have seen, giving me this perception that what I'm about to go through was impossible, but feeling as if there could be a chance that I would succeed and ultimately put a stop to whatever was going on. So when I did finally play the beginning part of the game, it was more of the same impression. Seeing that researcher die in front of you, all the zombies circling around you, the hangman kidnapping Sophie, it made me feel both very anxious yet compelled to win. It's funny because even though I didn't know who Sophie was and her relationship with Rogan, I kind of suspected that Sophie was important to Rogan, whenever their relationship was romantic, platonic, or friendly. So seeing Sophie run to Rogan only to be taken away by the hangman, even though I didn't really know who these characters were, I still sympathized with that situation enough to care. At that point, I was determined to save Sophie and stop whoever was causing this. I felt that way when I was a kid, and as an adult, I still do. Even though I'm very used to this game by now, for some reason, when I see the story play out, I still sometimes get that distressful feeling combined with that sense of responsibility. I still haven't played a game where its story is tonally like House of the Dead, where it captures a heavy sense of chaoticness and intensity. It's quite unique, and already that tone sets it apart from not only other light gun games, but even horror games both then and now. I don't think that it was unintentional by any means though, as this is a tone that gets articulated throughout the game. I feel that most people see this more with the gameplay, with how many enemies are put on screen along with the fast-paced gunplay, giving a sense of tension. But for me, easily my favorite aspect of the House of the Dead is how well the environment communicates atmosphere. The initial look of the mansion feels foreboding, sinister, and rather inauspicious, as the mansion is coated mostly in shadow, with only the very front revealing any sort of characteristics. The orange light illuminating from the dirty and filthy windows makes the mansion give off a very ill-omened feeling to it. It doesn't feel natural, or doesn't feel right, so to say. You can already notice how run down and dilapidated the mansion is, from the grime, mold, dirt, and the overall age of the material used to build the mansion, showing how worn it is. There's a crimson-colored door, similar to the blood of the corpses and zombies, invoking a sort of further discomfort. This is further complemented by the gloomy and weirdly enough dirty look of the overcast, which is no doubt just a JPEG they took and rotated around the level to make it look like clouds are moving. Yet, 22 years later, it's still effective at making you feel unsettled. You also get a good sense of the mansion's scale in terms of its length, providing a sense of intimidation as you proceed to approach it. The grimy walkway with cracks and breaks in its concrete leads you to a fountain, decorated with statues on two of the corners, further adding to the gothic horror vibe. Furthermore, it's filled with dirty and murky water that has turned to a brownish complexion, further suggesting how much the mansion has fallen apart. You begin to notice the dead trees, bushes, and grass surrounding you, decaying like the zombies roaming around, and the DBR employee corpses bleeding out and are left to rot. As you approach the mansion, your attention is brought to the bridge, very similar in detail to the fountain you just passed, as it leads you to the front of the mansion. However, if you didn't save the DBR researcher in time, you would be led toward the underground sewer, almost as if it was ripped straight from Victorian London itself, the ancient and mucky look of it feeling very unnerving. But if you do end up saving the DBR researcher, you proceed forward, observing the blood dripping down from the stairs, and gaining a closer look of how damaged and broken down the mansion really is. You also realize how massive the mansion is, quite literally towering over you, and it's a very anxious feeling. Then, as you face the crimson doors of the mansion, you strangely appreciate how detailed they are, but are still intimidated. Just the outside was already freaky enough. Is it worse inside the mansion? Who knows what lies beyond those doors? It doesn't take long to figure out, as Rogan shoots a door and kicks it open, quickly fading to black. Even now, reflecting on and describing the mansion, I get pretty anxious talking about it. But the good kind of anxiety, if that makes sense. It's just that I've never really played a game where you felt the weight and intensity of what you're about to go through. You see, where I feel many horror games use subtlety, psychological elements, or downright scare factors to generate fear or tension, The House of Dead is a game that uses and creates intense anxiety that gives an identity not many horror games have. It can be both subtly and overly intense at the same time, and that's what makes it super unique in my opinion. The mansion in this case perfectly articulates that well. Some elements, like its dilapidated and run-down look, feel more subtly tense and foreboding, as it may not be something you'll really notice the first time around. However, the massive scale of the mansion towering over you, along with that gloomy and disquietude overcast looming over the mansion, even to this day, I sometimes still say to myself, oh shit. It's for those reasons that the atmosphere is probably the most unique aspect of the original House of the Dead. And it's not just something that appears once outside the mansion and that be it. Nah, the various rooms throughout the mansion carry that atmosphere consistently, and can range from being purely subtle or overt, or can be blended together perfectly. In fact, it's shown right away after Rogan shoots down the front door and enters the foyer. Despite the room itself being pretty small, it's very grandiose in its nature. The swinging chandelier and the tall balcony stands out to me in particular, seemingly towering over you as the creatures take advantage of that environment to try and attack you. However, you begin to notice how truly dilapidated the interior is, not just on the balcony and the chandelier, but on the walls, floors, vases, doors, almost everywhere. Again, you do feel as if the mansion was once incredibly beautiful and well designed, but now everything is abandoned, left to waste, and is dead. This really is a house for the dead, which feels very well placed and perfectly designed. There's another room after the foyer showing dark gray concrete walls, immensely shadowing the room, only for you to turn and see a literal prison cell with chains and blood inside, along with 2 hostages and a zombie. That's just kinda straight up disturbing. It pretty much looks like a torture chamber or a dungeon. The color scheme was already giving bad vibes when you walk into the room, with the dark gray giving off this eerie complexion that feels rather unnatural. But then seeing that prison cell with the blood splatter kinda slaps you in the face. as again, it's really disturbing to see and think about people being trapped there. I tended to imagine that the zombie was chained up, giving some sort of psychological terror to those DBR employees trapped in there, which really bothered me thinking about it. Of course, if you took the Victorian London sewer away, and also made a few mistakes, you might have ended up in this courtyard looking area, which, similar to the outside of the mansion, mainly intimidates you because of the massive scale and ominous feeling that's presented. Again, the towering height and length simply overwhelms you because of the scale, making you feel concerned. But also, the way the section is crafted is particularly creepy. The gray and carefully trimmed detailed balconies are overwhelmed with shadows as zombies begin to appear from them. Broken staircases and rubble block certain paths as more zombies begin to come after you, also showing how much the mansion is falling into disrepair. The overcast appears more sinister as more foliage and grass is rotten and dead. On top of that, this particular section feels extremely claustrophobic. You're surrounded by the mansion in an extremely exposed position, all while you're turning around corners to find more zombies within arm's reach of you. It can be really intense in this part especially, considering that zombie with the fucking chainsaw walks out of the goddamn shadow room. Then there's this room where you face against Chariot, which may not seem all that remarkable, but this room creeps me out a lot more in its subtlety. Mainly how large, empty, and intimate the room is. There's no windows, no furniture, only the old and worn fireplace, some discolored walls and cobwebs, and an overhead skylight allowing for moonlight to pour into the room, reflecting off of Chariot's armor. Yet because of how closed off it is, with the door being the only way out, it leaves you feeling trapped while also making the fight seem more personal. There's nothing else in this room, just you, Sophie, and the monster that mortally wounded Rogan's fiance. Then in the next chapter, you're greeted to a connecting bridge, some leaves blowing in the howling wind as you turn to realize that you are stories high in the sky, with zombies roaming down below. The gothic black of the mansion becomes more apparent now, as you're up close to see how beautifully detailed the mansion is, especially with the large windows giving off a sort of mystical blue. It's cool to see how in such a short area you can get such a sinister and intimidating impression about a place. But you may have taken the underground passage in the previous room, leading you to the end of an underground sewer, revealing a dark hallway with a red velvet walkway leading you up to the kitchen. Obviously, the claustrophobic nature of a small hallway with zombies trying to kill you is V suspense, but also just the color scheme with the shadows and the red velvet is not only satisfying to look at, but appeals to the whole gothic nature of the mansion. Now, if you're taking that path or taking this elevator up to the bridge, you would eventually get led to this dining hall. Once again, the gothic aesthetic of the mansion becomes more apparent, with the crimson tablecloth on the lawn dining room table, the very colorful and detailed stained glass window, especially with how the room is lit, with the light and the shadows complementing the ominous nature perfectly. Notice how the shadows are used to emphasize the stained glass windows, in comparison to the columns almost looming out of the shadows, creating a sort of vagueness yet omnipresent nature to the whole room. Then you have this little walkway here, which is very similar to the bridge that I mentioned earlier with the beautifully gothic black of the mansion, but man, this part in particular creeps me out a lot. Mainly, it mostly has to do with the wind sound effect here. Just taking that in while you see a zombie roaming in the background with the ever-present dead forestation, as the night sky and a distant snowy mountain accompany you. I can't emphasize how creepy, intense, and beautiful this is. I just love how it made me feel so nervous. It's in this chapter that we get introduced to the more technological and futuristic aspects of the mansion, and this room in particular stands out to me a lot. Obviously, you knew the mansion as a research facility, but actually seeing it is strange, feeling as if you're not supposed to see any of this. Considering how advanced and technological this room looks, it makes you feel like you're going up against something larger and more powerful than you. Also, this room is really aesthetically pleasing. The crisp blue water illuminating a good portion of the room looks really nice in relation to the detailed solid black walls with the satisfying white floor and ceiling. Of course, I have to mention the rooftops where you fight the Hanged Man. Not only is the black rooftops gothic as fuck, once again giving a mysteriousness about the mansion, but the largest supermoon the world has ever seen is accompanying you, the Hanged Man, and the dark night sky, with the moonlight reflecting and illuminating off the mansion. But during the fight, the Hanged Man pushes you over the railing, with Rogan grabbing and hanging on from the edge of the roof. There's something purely atmospheric about this whole moment, hanging on for your life as the gothic black walls of the mansion surround you, with the orange illuminating glow of the windows giving big ominous vibes. All of this while you look down to see the dead trees and grass you've become familiar with in this game, only from stories high, making everything feel more tense, even as you watch the Hanged Man fall to the ground. Rogan then breaks through a window to the next chapter, as the technological and futuristic elements briefly shown in the last chapter are highlighted here. While the gothic horror nature of the mansion is no longer present, the same sense of anxiety still persists, as an uneasy premonition is shown in this part. You're in a pretty mysterious and concealed part of the mansion, a place where the zombies are created, so you feel once again that you're going up against something larger than yourself, and what you could have anticipated.
I mean, look at this room, for example. This room is changing the lights from an attractive red to a satisfying purple, as large amounts of zombies in cages are trying to kill you. Or this beautifully illuminated room coated in blue, with wiring and machinery everywhere, as zombie spiders are on the floor and ceiling. Or what about this massive facility right here that towers over you? Like, seriously, how big is this room? Not only does the worn look of the whole area give it a sense of it being recently lived in or used, but the massive cranes and machinery surrounding you makes you feel like you just walked in on a large-scale operation, once again demonstrating that sense of intensity. Then there are places like this area, with the gigantic lava pit, with the red glow of the lava radiating off the walls, or the prepossessing greens of the overgrown plants in the room where you see Kyrian and are introduced to the hermit, are so comprehensive that it creates that perception that you're fighting something larger than life. As always, the boss fight articulates these feelings well, as you fight Hermit climbing inside an octagonal pipe, greatly etched and detailed with a nice metallic blue, as a green and red light flashes periodically. This futuristic design once again emphasizing the anxiousness of the situation. Rogan jumps from the pipe as we reach the final chapter. While not as aesthetically remarkable as the first 3 chapters, the fact that we are going through this area underneath a mountain given by the rocky formation, with the beautiful limestone white and the massive stalagmites, kinda poetically reflects what you've just been through. Finding your way through a gothic mansion, to a futuristic research facility, to now an underground research facility in a mountain. The weight of the world feels like it's on your shoulders as you battle Chariot and the Hangman one last time, and as a large hallway leads you to a door with the Kyrian family crest, and it fades quickly to black once again. All of a sudden, you are faced with some gigantic piece of machinery, illuminated with a light blue on the inside as a large ring is spinning above a distant figure. Turquoise lights run across the wall, a dark bluish gray coats the rest of the room, while Kyrian stands in front of glowing monitors, blinking various colors. Kyrian gives a big speech about how you'll never defeat him, despite how impressed he is that you've made it so far. In retrospect, considering all the things you've done, it's actually pretty impressive that you went through so much insane stuff. But you were afraid of this, as surely that figure that you saw in the distance is Kyrian's own personal masterpiece, the Magician. It proceeds to attack Kyrian, killing him as it breaks open a gate as you stand on top of a balcony, the wind blowing as you look at the Magician levitating. This final boss in this area in which you fight in is just perfect. Rocky limestone spires are in view, almost as if they are reaching for the heavens themselves. The darkening clouds with the sun rising as it breaks a spot in them, illuminating the mountains in the back and the balcony, continuously giving a sort of heavenly kind of feeling. The balcony giving just the right amount of space for the Magician to circle above you, all while the facility can be seen with the broken gate and the Kyrian family crest above it. As the Magician starts to use its final attack, it stands perfectly in the center as its attack flies above you with the dark clouds highlighting the raining fireballs. Everything about this is atmospherically perfect. It excellently shows off the magnitude and vehemence the environment was leading to, fighting a godlike creature. It truly is a final battle the way everything is portrayed, especially with the beautiful lighting of the dark clouds and the sun, along with those towering spires and the incredible alluring illumination of the mountains. It feels extremely fitting given how ferocious and apprehensive everything has been so far. It's a battle of the ages, so to say, a battle of mythical proportions. And as the last shots are fired, with the Magician exploding and saying its final words,
You haven't seen anything yet.
another explosion fades to a white. Revealing a bright blue sky with crisp white clouds. Rogan begins talking to himself, saying the battle is over.
Everything is over. I have nothing more to lose. However, I must go on.
along with a goodbye to Kyrian and a goodbye to his beloved Sophie.
Goodbye, Kyrian. Farewell, Sophie.
The credits roll, and as Rogan walks through all the locations you went through, allowing you not to only reflect on what you just done, but allowing you to reflect over all the areas and locations you just conquered. It's a great way to end an intense journey. So, why did I basically just talk about the entire game? Well, I wanted to show that House of the Dead carries its unique atmosphere throughout the whole game, and I really didn't want to skip a beat. Although some areas convey the feeling better than others, throughout the whole game, and no matter where you go, you'll always be confronted with an intensity and anxiety that is uniquely present through its usage of gothic horror and futuristic elements, and has been a foundation in which the series has set itself apart. Now, it's not just the environment alone that conveys this feeling. Tetsuya Kawachi's incredible production complements the game so well, incorporating the synthesized house music of the late 90s and mixing that in with the eerie progression chords of a church organ. It helps build up the atmosphere a lot as you're walking through these rooms and locations, further emphasizing the tense nature of the game. Now, while much of the soundtrack does also complement the expeditious gameplay, especially with the fast movement and rapid gunplay, the soundtrack also gives you a sense of dread whenever it gets featured. I mean, I don't find it coincidental that the first song you hear in Chapter 1 has become so synonymous with the series as a whole. The iconic guitar riff taken from a sample pack that builds the track up and creating an energetic rhythm, the fast-paced drum licks accompanied by the sharp organ chords providing an uncanny and otherworldly nature to the atmosphere, the horns further building up the track, going from deep low notes all the way to sharp high notes, capturing a sense of grandiose to the song, and some chilling violin chords laid into the track, bestowing a supernatural apprehensiveness to the player. The song perfectly aligns with all the iconography you see in the game, seeing the gothic mansion towering over you with those gothic features being present in all the rooms of the mansion, the dilapidated, abandoned, yet detailed state of the mansion being featured as well, along with the various zombies trying to murder you and the other DBR hostages, is really excellently articulated through the song. I still remember my first time hearing it as well. The chilling organ and grandiose horns playing as I failed to save one of the DBR employees that was thrown over the bridge by a zombie. Seeing the lifeless body there on the floor made me feel powerless, with the music highlighting the horror of what I'm seeing. The music is just crafted extremely well. And just like the mansion, the music helps assist the atmosphere throughout the whole game. Chapter 2's music builds up with a synthesized bass progression along with a kick and snare lick, setting the pace of the whole song, as the creepy organ chords appear again, building up the atmosphere further as the sharp sounds permeates throughout the song. The synthetic arpeggios also complement the organ, creating a sort of uncanny and uneasy feeling while you are listening to it. This gets eventually led to some dissonant voice samples over the beat and a new chord progression on the organ, highlighting those voice samples as you hear It's V-spooky. Chapter 3's music plays more like a normal rave house song, which does make sense regarding how you are exploring an advanced research facility, but still retains a creepy feeling about the song. The saw wave bass and the orchestral stab sounding very dissonant, for instance, especially with how the notes progress. Also, there's a theremin sounding ass MIDI synth featured, which also adds a V-spoopy feeling to the track as well.
Chapter 4's music is more cinematic this time around, with a chanting choir, blaring horns, and the symphonic violins accumulating the tension of the track as it develops from a lower octave to a higher octave. Also, the orchestral stab going further adds to the tension of the track. It's a great track to use as you are deep underground, approaching the end game with everything feeling more climactic. Then there's the Magician's theme, probably the best song on the entire soundtrack. Once again, the orchestral stab builds up the track as a drum break carries the listener to the main progression. The organ returns once again, being the lead progression, elevating up higher and higher, as a deep kick provides the rhythm for the whole track. Over the course of the song, the progression changes instrumentally from a saw wave synth giving a sense of height and elevation, to the orchestral violins giving more of a grounded, unsettling lower tone to finish off the loop, contrasting greatly from the saw that just played. It's such a great track. It not only makes the battle between the magician more arduous and grand, but it perfectly fits the atmosphere that this fight is happening on. Hearing the different progressions shifting between instruments while you are seeing the light breaking through the dark clouds illuminating the balcony is quite memorable, and is easily one of the most indelible experiences I've encountered in the game. Of course, the monster designs added much to the atmosphere as well. The creepy and supernatural look of the zombies is pretty iconic, and obviously greatly attached to the atmosphere. The gore in particular comes to attention a lot. Obviously, when you have chunks of flesh exposed and bony complexions, it's going to be pretty unnerving to look at. But the amount of variety of zombie designs is what really manufactures a lot of the fear. Cyril, for example, is probably the most iconic zombie. A zombie with a missing left eye, leaking blood, with torn and tattered clothes, dual-wielding axes as it approaches you, or throws those axes from a distance. There's Simon, being a really strong muscular shirtless zombie with its left arm being exposed muscle, that can throw barrels and even people, and tends to run towards you getting ready to punch. Or there's Samson, being that fucking zombie with the chainsaw. Fuck this zombie and his dumb overalls. And the more designs you see, like Burner attacking like Samson but having a blowtorch instead of a chainsaw, or Ruben being a small, fast, nimble zombie that attacks with metal claws, it instills much fearfulness and distress. I mean, these are armies of zombies, all designed with a different purpose and all designed to kill you. Their designs are just downright creepy and disturbing, yet you have to face them. It leaves you holding your breath, knowing that you have to be careful and quick in each encounter. However, the boss designs in particular stand out a lot. The chariot in Chapter 1 has its metallic armor scuffed and worn, implying that it fought and had its own battles. The giant gas mask obscuring much of its face, while also creating much intimidation, as you don't feel like you know what it properly looks like. The giant bloody bardiche being a giant bloody bardiche, like seriously man, that's pretty terrifying. The exposed breastplate glowing a dark red, adding a sort of mysticism to the design as well. The fleshy pink humanoid figure that breaks out of the armor once its health is low enough, with these weird tendrils moving around, making the chariot seem more otherworldly, and those pieces of pink flesh breaking off to reveal the skeletal body of the chariot, further making the chariot seem very supernatural. It's not only super creative, but its design greatly complements the intense nature the game creates. The Hangman Chapter 2 has a gargoyle-esque design, once again creating a sort of mystical premonition about it. The red glowing eyes, the veiny wings, and sharp claws, contrasting with the muscular human chest and legs, also create that mystical and unnatural feeling about the design. Also, I always found the leather armor to be a neat addition. I feel that it gives the Hangman a sort of battle-ready look like the chariot, almost like the Hangman is the executioner, especially with the leather mask over its face. The Hermit in Chapter 3 probably has one of the weaker designs in the game because it's just a giant spider, but it's also a giant spider, and fuck spiders. And of course, the Magician Chapter 4 is by far the most unique and creative design of all the monsters and bosses. Everything about the Magician's design is so inventive and imaginative. A tall, flexible, and agile design, given how slender and lean its overall shape is, and given that it's levitating off the ground doing a JoJo stance, gives you an impression that the Magician will be a creature that moves really fast, at least to some capacity. The very sturdy and rugged exposed muscles with the tendons and ligaments pulsating, and the scaly gray armor on its body, noticing how it can sometimes curve like on the shoulders and leg right here, creates the sense that the Magician is also a really strong and resilient enemy. What is most notable about its design though is the demon-esque iconography of the Magician. The horns curving all the way in the back, the pointy ears, and especially the sharp claws on its hands and feet, makes the magician feel very mythical, as if Kyrian somehow summoned some ancient mythological creature. The mythological element is also present in the very human face of the magician, its right eye gone with the exposed muscle, and the red gash on his left eye, which adds a bizarreness and peculiarity to the design, a quality that many figures in mythology tend to have. This all makes the magician a very unsettling creature to look at, especially considering the environment in which you are finding the magician in. This mythological design is very fitting. Find something almost akin to a god. It really makes the final battle seem very extraordinary and enormous, yet apprehensive and perturbed. I mean, you're fighting a godlike creature and all you have is just a handgun. It feels impossible and it makes everything feel tense and worryful. But you know it's something you have to beat. You know that you have to defeat it despite how terrifying it can be to look and face it. And that makes this boss in particular one of the most unique fights in the game I played. All these elements, the music and the monster design, add so much to the fearful and uneasy nature, combining the futuristic house music along with the eerie instrumentals, whether that be an organ or a synth. And the grotesque, mysterious, and otherworldly monster designs create that uneasy atmosphere that this game is so unique for. But there's a reason why this first chapter is mainly addressing the environment and locations of the game. I was scared of the Kyrian Mansion as a kid, and even today, I still feel unnerved whenever I look at it. I mean, it's so beautiful in its detail, and I can admire it all day for how artistic and incredible it is. But whenever I'm playing the game, as I'm quickly shooting the zombies coming from me in multiple directions, I get freaked out a lot by what's around me. Whenever it's seeing a massive gothic mansion looming in the background with dead bodies and foliage around me as it seemingly overwhelms me due to the massive scale, seeing a dark damp dungeon with blood splatters and chains on the grey walls, the overall state of disrepair and dilapidation of a courtyard surrounded by zombies, a large, intimate, worn, and discolored room as I'm trapped with an armored humanoid with a bloodied bardiche, standing on a bridge stories in the sky, the dark abyss that is a mansion around me as the sound of the howling wind accompanies my thoughts. A dining room mysteriously illuminated as the crimson red of the tablecloth develops a unique vibrancy about the room. Staring up into the night sky with the gigantic moon illuminating the battlefield, as a gargoyle-esque figure with bats flying around it is in perfect frame. Walking through the mysterious and unnatural research facilities, vibrant colors and technology that I never knew existed around me, as if I'm walking in on some completely bizarre and unfamiliar territory. Seeing a huge massive production center still fully operational and recently lived in. A large massive lava pit in my view as I look up to see the intricate machinery used for the strange area. Shooting at a large spider as it climbs the metallic blue walls of a pipe to try and reach me. Walking through massive limestone caverns with large stalagmites overhead, truly feeling as if I'm approaching the endgame. A massive piece of machinery, illuminated by a mystifying blue, used to incubate this mysterious figure, looking as if it's something larger than life. Then facing that mythological and godlike figure on top of a balcony. The rising sun breaking through the clouds to illuminate the battlefield, as limestone spires seem to ascend above. This is what makes the House of the Dead stand out to me so much. This atmosphere it develops is something that I've never experienced in a game before. I've never played a game before that made me feel extremely anxious whenever I played it, and how it creates that anxiety is very unique to me. And I do feel that the gameplay also plays a large role in the intensity of the game. But if you were to ask me what I felt the foundation of the series is laid upon, I would say it would be the atmosphere, in particular the environment, assisted by the music and monster designs. And in many ways, the developers knew this. The House of the Dead 2 and 4 feature a lot of the gothic and futuristic elements of the locations established by 1, featuring much of the dilapidated, creepy features of the mansion, but on the massive scale of the city of Venice, and including more scientific and technological elements shown in the Goldman building. House of the Dead 3 chooses to focus more on the technological aspects, with much of the areas you are exploring and fighting in being unnerving abandoned research facilities. Tetsuya Kawachi would return to do the soundtrack in House of the Dead 2, once again bringing the gothic house music to assist the eerie atmosphere of a grotesque Venice. However, he wouldn't return for 3 and 4, and while the soundtracks deviate from the more gothic and horror intuitions that 1 and 2 had, they are still really good soundtracks that convey a sense of urgency, tension, and sometimes uncanniness. 3 has a more orchestral soundtrack to it, which is neat, but it doesn't feel as uncanny as the previous soundtracks. It's still really good though. The 4th soundtrack, on the other hand, is a fucking banger, and is just as creepy as the original soundtrack, and complements the locations really well. And as for the monster designs, each game definitely improved on the zombies looking more creepy, torn apart, detailed, disgusting, and gory as the series progressed. It's the same for the bosses as well, as designs became more intricate, creative, and mythological as the series went on. Some of my favorite bosses include Strain from the House of the Dead 2, an executionary-style behemoth with cuts on its body and axes in its chest that's wielding a giant worn chainsaw. The Wheel of Fate, being the final boss of the House of Dead 3, is the resurrected Kyrian, as a shiny metallic humanoid with some giant floating ring around him, shooting out telekinesis while manipulating the cyber realm around you. And the Star from the House of Dead 4 is really cool to me. A humanoid dressed in a red hooded trench coat, dual-wielding 2 butterfly swords radiating purple energy beams as he levitates off the ground. It's peak anime material, but it once again adds much to the intensity of what you're facing, as you're going up against giant humanoids with chainsaws, godlike figures, and flamboyant anime men. It's crazy and I love it. And these elements are what makes up and assist the overall atmosphere of the House of the Dead. If you ask me how I'd describe House of the Dead's identity, well, this is what I would start with. This atmosphere, this presentation, and this world is unlike any other games I've played. The unsettledness you feel when roaming the decrepit streets of Venice, or the creepy abandoned research facilities. The hype but tension you feel when the iconic house music plays, and the feeling when you see the detailed, gory, and disturbing monsters surrounding you. That's House of the Dead's atmosphere. And all started here, because of a phone call on December 18th, 1998, as 2 AMS agents saw a large Gothic mansion looming and towering over them.